Welcome back to Let's Get Real. I'm Karie. I'm Raven, and this is
Crawford.
Would you like to introduce yourself more?
Okay. Well, I don't know. What would you like me to say?
Well, you're a father too. You're a Democrat
Yes.
Party.
Yeah, for the Democratic Party, but that's fairly, like I say, somewhat relevant, but it can be irrelevant to the larger issue at stake that I think you want to discuss here. I think probably more pertinent to all this will be the fact that I have a bachelor's degree in political science and government with minor degrees in history and public administration. I obtained those from Ashford University, which is based in Iowa. And also, right now I'm actively a member of a number of organizations. The Licking County Democratic Club, I've been a member of that since 2004 at least. When I was 19 years old, I joined it. I was a volunteer with the Karie campaign, and later on that led to this reinvigoration within that club. Right now I am I was elected to be the second vice president of the club for this year, but when the club president resigned, I became the first vice president, and right now I'm campaigning to be the club president in light of the election. But also, I'm chairman of what's called the Freedom School of Licking County, which is an organization that exists to try and help. It tries to help educate working people about their rights and help provide them with the tools needed to stand up for their rights as laborers. And lastly, in 2011, I founded what is now the 99% of North and East Central Ohio, which is an organization inspired by the Occupy Wall Street movement to fight on behalf of average people in defense of our democracy against the oligarchy. Anyways, so proceed with whatever questions you have.
Okay, and our first question we wanted to know is, who did you want as president and why, and who did you end up voting for?
Well, when this whole thing started out, before the 2015 campaign got underway, and before anyone announced, my original choice, who I wanted to run, was Elizabeth Warren. She's the junior senator from the state of Massachusetts. And, well, actually, now she's the senior senator, if I'm not mistaken. But either way, I've seen her as a progressive leader throughout all of this, and she's taken on Wall Street and helped lead the way for the creation of what's called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is a government agency created by the Dodd-Frank law in 2010 that exists to help protect consumers from abuses by corporations when they try to get a cheap dollar out of you. And one of the things that like to target are unfair practices in business dealings, like for instance, like the fine print. They want to make sure that companies are actually upholding their end of the bargain. Essentially, that's kind of like a small example of what they do. But at the end of the day, for a number of reasons, but mostly because of her advocacy on behalf of working people, I supported her at first. But when the candidates started to announce, she made it clear that she didn't want to run, despite a pretty long effort to try and get her to run. But when there were candidates who were starting to hint that they would run, I shifted over immediately to my favorite senator in the U.S. Senate, Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. I've long been a fan of his, been following him for years, and when it was hinted that he might run, I immediately said, well, if he runs, I'm 100% behind him. I supported him for a great number of reasons. A lot of it for the same reason I supported Elizabeth Warren. This is a man who pretty much came up from nothing. He's one of the poorest members of the Senate. He's the longest serving independent in the U.S. Congress in our history. And none of that's really important. What's really important is that no matter what, he always takes a stand on behalf of working people at the end of the day. There's a popular meme that goes around social media that says for the past 30 years of him being in Congress, every time there's been some major terrible thing that's going on in Washington, D.C., there is a video of some sort with Bernie Sanders standing up opposing it, When it came to the Iraq War, he was adamantly opposed to that. When it came to the Patriot Act, he was opposed to that. And he also opposed to a number of perceived abuses by even the current president. And you can guarantee as President Trump takes office, Bernie Sanders will be right there yet again, standing up against whatever abuses this man may take on. But that's who I wanted. That's who I supported in the Ohio primary and throughout the primary process. And then at the end of the day, on election day, I ended up voting for Hillary Clinton, which was by no stretch of the imagination a difficult decision on my part because I have no trust for Senator, or I should say Secretary Clinton, for a number of reasons. You know, because she is I've always said it like this. She represents everything that's wrong with our politics, only because she will say whatever she needs to say in front of a certain group of people in order to win. And I had a lot of trust issues with her. A lot of it stemmed from me being angry with her about her vote in favor of the Iraq War. I also didn't like her vote in favor of the Patriot Act. I mean, a number of things that she took positions in favor of where Wall Street lines up on things. The only reason why I ended up voting for her was I watched her convention speech. And I was desperately looking for a reason to want to vote for her because I did not want to contribute in any way, shape, or form to Donald Trump becoming president. My At the end of the day, my rationale behind voting for her was, she spoke in favor of advancing the progressive platform, which was passed by the Democratic National Committee that Bernie Sanders ended up fighting for. She said, let's take this progressive agenda and put it forward. And I thought to myself, I'm going to hold her accountable to that. And with Senator Bernie Sanders still in the U.S. Senate, I'm expecting him and Elizabeth Warren and other progressives in Congress to hold her accountable. And if she doesn't win, then if she doesn't do what she says she's going to do, I was planning on voting against her in the next Democratic primary. Now, and my argument was that for a number of reasons, it was dangerous to let Donald Trump win at this moment, as opposed to Hillary, because Hillary, if she failed, there could still be a potential for either Senator Sanders or someone like him to come up and challenge her in the future. But I don't want to get too much off subject of what you're going to get into, but I have a whole argument that I can offer later on at a later time, or even later in this conversation if you want, as to why I, go more into detail why I thought electing Hillary was better as opposed to Trump. But okay, what was your next question?
So my question was, how do you feel about Hillary Clinton winning the popular vote by 2,017,563 people, yet Donald Trump still won, which means, in all reality, America actually wanted Hillary Clinton as president, not Donald Trump?
Here's an interesting thing about the Electoral College. We are the only democracy on the face of the planet that has a system like the Electoral College. There are a number of reasons for that. A lot of people just don't care about politics whatsoever. But whether you care about politics or not, at the end of the day, politics are going to affect your life in some way, whether you believe it or not. Politics affects how much money you make because politics affects the laws which bind employers to pay you whatever they want to pay you. Because without minimum wage laws, they could pay you as little as a dime an hour if they wanted to, even less than that. Heck, they could enslave you if they wanted to without politics. I mean, women having the right to vote, that's simply politics right there. Because when this country was founded, the only people who had the right to vote at first were white men who owned property. That was it. So if you were a poor person or a poor woman, you had no say whatsoever in our government at all. So that's a small example of, that's a big part of what we have to deal with here is apathy, which is lack of caring about what's going on. But the Electoral College has an interesting history behind it. Like I said, we're the only, advanced democracy in the world, or any democracy in the world, that has such a system. And the reason why we do is because at our nation's founding, when what was called the Articles of Confederation collapsed, which that previous system had it to where the states had all the power, you had a system where the founding fathers were trying to figure out how to rebuild this country after the original system that we had in place during the American Revolution, after it fell apart because it failed to respond to a rebellion appropriately. And it showed some serious signs of weakness, and they wanted to continue our unity as a country. So a big argument happened, and part of the discussion was, how do we keep this country united, but how do we try to maintain the power of the states? Now, this was a huge concern. That's why the previous system had, in the Articles of Confederation, had a system where the states had all the control, basically. And you, at the time, had 13 states, and you had a president, but it was a very, very weak president. Our central government was extremely weak. Each state had one vote in this Continental Congress. So you had the Congress, which had very weak power and only met, like, I think, once a year. And then you had, or once whenever it was convened by the president. But the president was an extremely weak figure. And that was intentional. But when time came to respond to a rebellion that emerged when a bunch of Revolutionary War veterans were demanding that they get paid, and a lot of property issues were coming up, this Congress failed to act, in an expedient way. So the country almost fell apart within a decade or so of us, winning our independence. And so that's what caused the system. However, the states still wanted their power, especially slave states. Slave states were scared that by strengthening a federal government, that their right to enslave people would be endangered. So they wanted very much to still have a say. Now, the Electoral College was a part of a whole series of compromises to help maintain power of the states. Although in a federal system, the central government, or the federal government as we call it, which represents the entire country, its powers are seen as equal to that of the states, except when the two have a conflict, in which case the central government, or rather the federal laws, tend to be superior, as per the Constitution. So when it came to the election of our president, you're dealing with the late 1700s, an era when literacy wasn't very high, meaning that not very many people knew how to read, and not very many people knew enough about politics in general to make an educated decision. And like I said earlier, the only people who had a right to vote at that time were white men who owned property. And so you really had a system that was very exclusionary at the very beginning, and that most of the country really didn't have a say. But the founding fathers were afraid of having a system where the president was directly elected, because the only directly elected officials throughout the country at the time were members of the state legislatures, meaning people who were, at the state version of the Senate and the House, or members of the House of Representatives, because even back then the U.S. Senate wasn't designed to have direct elections by the people. The U.S. Senate was actually elected by our state legislatures at the time. But what they were afraid of with a president being directly elected by the people was that the people, being uneducated, would be empowered to elect a dictator, essentially. Because at the time they were seeing in France the rise of who would later become Napoleon Bonaparte. And through a direct election of their president, the French elected Napoleon, and he became a dictator, and they were afraid of something happening here in the United States of that nature. So what they decided was, instead of allowing the people to elect the president like they elect their members of Congress, or like they elect their members of state legislatures, because even at the time, governors weren't even elected by the people. They were also chosen by their state legislatures. But so what they thought was, since the people could not be trusted to choose their leader directly because we were so ignorant, it would be preferable that the state governments elect basically members of an electoral college, which were a group of elitists. There were far fewer of them back then, because basically each state at the time, the 13 states, each state would have an equal representation of electors to their members of Congress. So you're always going to have no less than 3 electors. That's, because you'll never have any less than 1 member of the House and no less than 2 members of the Senate. Well, every state has 2 members of the Senate. And that's a whole other issue as to why that is. But so basically the small states would always have 3 electoral college votes. and the large states basically have, I can't say an unlimited amount, but it's always in proportion to their population. Now, since small states have a guarantee of no less than 3, and there is kind of a cap on how many the large states can have, what that does is it creates this outside system where the small states have a little bit more influence than the large states, because for their citizens, basically that each elector represents more per citizen than what the populations in the large states do. So, but there's a good comparison of it on this one meme that I saw on Facebook recently. But you can't always base your facts on Facebook. But when you look at the value of how we look at citizens of one state compared to another, it was pretty accurate, and I recommend anyone look at that comparison. So what this was seen in a lot of ways as a way of protecting the slave states from a president possibly coming in who would influence an abolition of slavery. So what they did was, by the states allowing the states or having the states to elect their electors, the states controlled who the next president would be. So basically it was seen as the elitists, the establishment of every state, if you will, choosing who they believed was the most qualified potential candidate to be president. And so for like the first, I want to say about 30 years or so of our history, the American people had no influence whatsoever as to who our president would be. It was all decided by the states, because they would choose the electors, and the electors would choose the next president. So basically, it was just a small group of politicians who would get in a room, basically, and they would just decide who's going to be the next president. They would look through their options, and they would more or less choose their favorite establishment candidate. And that was just, you could complain all you want to your members of Congress and stuff, but at the end of the day, you had no real influence over who your next president would be. That all changed in the election of 1824, I think it was, when Andrew Jackson ran for president. He lost this time, but he became the first person to win the popular vote but lose the electoral college. But that's kind of a misleading finding, only because not all the states in the country decided their electoral college votes by popular vote in the states. So we can get into this a little bit later, but the original intent of the electoral college was to serve as a protection from tyranny rising, because the electors are supposed to choose the most qualified candidate, and they were supposed to be chosen by the states themselves, the state governments, meaning elected officials, people who are experienced in politics, were supposed to be choosing others to represent them in Congress to choose the next president. But now, part of the problem with the Electoral College now is that ever since the American people have a vote on a state-by-state basis, ever since we gained that vote, we have diluted the effectiveness of the Electoral College, in that the system, which was designed to protect the establishment from the people, has now been perverted to the point where the people, the very group that was feared by our founding fathers, are more or less getting around those protections, because we now influence who our electors are. We now, because when you vote for president, you're not technically voting for president. You're technically voting for electors who you will send, to your state conventions or whatever, and then they'll vote, and then they send the results of their vote to Congress. And then Congress, in a joint session, certifies that vote, and then we elect our president officially. So what we've done now is, ever since the American people have a vote for president at all, even if it's indirect, we've circumvented this whole process, and we've rendered it meaningless, since like, we have a popular vote, but the popular vote has no bearing except for on a state-by-state basis. And because we have a two-party system, which was never envisioned by the founding fathers, that two-party system essentially it creates this false dichotomy where you have to choose between Democrat and Republican, or whoever the two parties are. And because the system designed to be representative of the people has been manipulated to work just for the two parties because they've written themselves into the code as well. I can get more into that in another discussion. But and I feel like I've just droned on and on in a way.
You're fine.
But I just wanted to try and underline kind of the basis for this electoral college is that was its whole purpose, was to protect the establishment from the people, and it no longer serves that purpose. And it hasn't for a very long time, pretty much since the 1820s, ever since every state increasingly started to allow the people, the electorate, to choose our electoral college. And I mean, there's just no point. Why are you electing electors who aren't even completely bound to vote the way their state? Why are we still choosing these people when the elites of our society are no longer choosing them? Because that was the whole point to have them in the first place. And now we're just more or less electing people who we hope will vote the way we voted. And that's what you're doing. You're just choosing for people whose names you'll never know, voting for people whose names you'll never know, to go and vote on your behalf in a winner-take-all system, which means the person who wins your state in all but 2 states in the country, the person that wins your state wins all of the electors for your state. Here in the state of Ohio, we have 18 electors for our 2 senators and 16 members of the House. We have 18 electors. Donald Trump won Ohio, and although Hillary Clinton won roughly about, I think it's like 43% of the vote here in Ohio, Donald Trump gets 100% of the electors here in Ohio, which underrepresents the support that was here for her in Ohio, but he gets all of the electors as if he won 100% of the vote here in Ohio. That's the other part of the problem with this system, is that it underrepresents the diversity of support in our country for one candidate or the other. So I'll let you get on to your next question.
So is it fair to say that if given the choice, you would like to abolish the electric vote?
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
Would you abolish? I would. Yeah.
Well,
I think that's so wrong.
I think it's important to sort of, I mean, I kind of elaborated on why I would want to abolish it by hinting here and there. I am a strong advocate, have been for a long time, for direct election of our president. Now, in order to accomplish this, in order to actually abolish the Electoral College, you would have to have a constitutional amendment, which is a very complicated and long process, and it requires either 2/3 vote of each chamber of Congress, in addition to 3/4 vote of the state legislatures, or it would require 2/3 of the states to call conventions, to call for a convention of some sort to to amend the Constitution. Afterwards, you would still need 3/4 states to approve. So you would need supermajorities to amend the Constitution. There is another route, though.
Black man.
Well, no. The alternative route to changing the system and effectively, I say effectively abolishing Electoral College is to, I think it's called, I want to say Path to 270, but that's not what it is. It's this proposal which requires a number of states which represent 270 Electoral College votes, which is what's needed to win the presidency. Mm-hmm. There's a movement that's been going on for a little bit over a decade, I think it is, to get states to bind their electors to the result of the popular vote. And once this movement reaches 270 Electoral College votes, meaning enough states that represent that, once it reaches that point, it goes into effect as of the next presidential election. So, say, you had enough states this time around that went with this measure, it's just as simple as passing it on as a state law. Say you had enough of those states that bound themselves to this, once the popular vote went into effect, once the popular vote would show, like, say, Hillary Clinton winning a plurality, which is what she won. She didn't win a majority, she won a plurality of the vote. Once you would have her do that, she would end up getting 207 Electoral College votes just because. However, I still have to issue a caveat to even this proposal, because although it would help solve the system in a way, it still doesn't deal with the fact that none of these electors are bound by law to absolutely have to vote the way those states want them to. And I think it's actually unconstitutional to require them to do so because the electors were seen as having to have so much power. But I've been a strong advocate for this ever since at least when I was 16 years old. I used to be very fascinated with the Electoral College just because, when I was a kid, I thought it was just amazing to watch our system in action. But when in 2000 I saw the election go the way that it did, with Bush being given the presidency despite losing the popular vote by 500,000 votes, I thought to myself, well, there's something weird with this system. And ever since then, I've been a fierce advocate for abolishing it. And just, note, even if Hillary had won the Electoral College vote and had lost the popular vote, I would still be advocating for this. I've been a consistent advocate against this system. And I would think it was an injustice to Trump if he had won the popular vote but yet lost the election.
Yeah.
Because this is not a system which unites the American people, especially when you have a split like this. I mean, that was one of the other arguments for it, is that this was a way to bring the country together to unite us, because the winner of the Electoral College vote would be seen as someone who would win like a significant majority. However, they're winning a majority of states, but they're not winning a majority of the American people. This has now happened 5 times in our history. And and the problem is, one of the interesting aspects of it is, no Democrat has ever won the presidency without the popular vote. Each time the popular vote has been won, at least 4 of those times, because the Republican Party didn't exist in 1824, but each of the other times, the Republicans won. Each time. And it was always a very divided nation after those elections.
Okay. How do you think Hillary Clinton handled the loss of the election?
Well, she, and this is somewhat unrelated to a degree from the Electoral College issue. I mean, obviously she lost the election because of the Electoral College. But I thought she handled it gracefully. And I say this as someone who's been a fierce critic of her. As a matter of fact, during her concession speech, someone who has seen her as being kind of robotic throughout her entire political career, someone who just looks like she's just saying what her handlers want her to say, I thought when she gave her concession speech that we actually saw Hillary, the real Hillary. We saw her as the genuine person that she is. And I thought she handled it well. I mean, she conceded gracefully. Granted, she conceded the next morning after the election. But, she went into this like many others who have been observing this went into it. Anyone else who had been paying attention to the polls and the polling averages, she went into this thinking she was going to win. Actually, she went into this expecting to win. I think it's part of the reason why she lost is because she expected to win. And that's something that the Democratic Party as a whole has to address, is this expectation of getting the vote. I mean, instead of earning the vote, they expect to get the vote. That's part of the problem. But I thought she handled it well. And I think that was a hallmark of a true leader of the country. And once again, I say this as someone who has been a fierce critic of Hillary Clinton throughout most of my life. You had a question earlier that kind of deviated from, pertaining to Paul Ryan, Republicans, and all of them, and Donald Trump wanting to increase the size of the military. I have a military family. I love the military. But Donald Trump, just like Romney before him, pretty much all Republicans, they use the military as a cheap wedge against the people. They like to say, we're not strong enough as a country. We don't have a bigger military. We're not strong enough as a country. They want us to believe that we're still in an era of Cold War. That we're still in an era where there's another country out there that has as many soldiers as we do. That's basically as well positioned as we are to be dominant on the world stage. But what those people don't understand is our military, no matter how small its size, no matter how few weapons we have or how few tanks or ships we have out there, our military is the best positioned in the world. We are strategically positioned throughout the planet. Pretty much we're definitely on every continent on the planet. I believe possibly almost in every country on the planet, or near every country on the planet. And we have more nuclear weapons than anyone. Our nuclear weapons are upgraded to where they can reach pretty much everywhere on this earth. And they can be deployed, from submarines, and from jets, from land. I mean, they can be deployed from any source. Whereas, Russia or China, they are decades behind us in respects in that. And not only that, but we also, our weaponry is technologically advanced beyond any country in the world. So when we hear Republicans complain about how small our military is, what they're not telling you is that we no longer live in a world where the military has to be big. We have drones, for heaven's sake. We can send robots to kill for us. And they're actually actively working on programs to create even more robots that can operate on land, not just in the air. So we actually have less of a need for soldiers. It's only a matter of time before they create drones that operate ships, that can operate missions. I mean, you think of the movie Terminator with all those,
Or Iron Man.
or Iron Man with like robots that are invading countries and destroying them. We're not far away from that. Probably a few decades away from being able to just send robots to do our killing for us. I mean, we're that far advanced. These advancements keep working and moving. And the thing is, they talk about us not having a big enough military. They want us to think that there is this growing threat in the world, for our military to have to face, as if the Soviet Union still exists. The Soviet Union collapsed. Yes, China has a large military, Russia has a large military, but if you really think that the Russian or Chinese military could defeat ours in a head-to-head combat, then you, number one, are disrespecting our military and their skills, and number two, just completely ignorant to how well armed our military is and how advanced it is. But the Republicans use this because, especially Trump has capitalized on this, has kind of mastered it. They use this whole argument of growing the military because it makes us feel strong, big. This is a typical argument for nationalists, a typical argument for fascists. Nationalism is a cornerstone of fascism because in order to get people to rally behind your cause, one of the things you have to say is, we are one nation. We are strong. No one can defeat us, especially when we come together. And what nationalism is it's a hyper version of patriotism. One can make the argument, there's nothing wrong with being proud of your country, which there's not. There's nothing wrong with being a proud American. But when you are blinded by that patriotism, and you come to believe that your country is far superior to any other country or any other group of people on the face of the earth, and you are unwilling to question the actions of your country, that's when you start to go from patriotism into nationalism, and that your loyalty isn't so much to your fellow countrymen, it's just to that flag or to your government. That's what the flag is. It is a symbol of our government. And some people pick and choose when they are nationalists. They're not nationalists when President Obama is in the White House. They're not loyal to government then. They're highly suspect of President Obama because they think he's some kind of quasi-dictator, although far from it. That's another discussion for another day. But when it comes down to it, they are adamantly for someone like a Donald Trump, this strong man. He's going to take on those pitiful little bullies and those terrorists. He's going to get them terrorists, And it's about making people feel big and strong in this global world of threats. When it comes to so that's one aspect of it, is the military is mostly just a tool to fuel that nationalist sentiment, which is meant to empower someone like Donald Trump. He's the leader of this strong nation with this great military. He'll rebuild this military from scratch, which is honestly an argument that Hitler had used because he oversaw the military of Germany come from what was basically, it was an illegal uprising of the German military. They weren't supposed to have an offensive one after World War I, but he rebuilt it and made it a force to be reckoned with, and that helped embolden him. That helped get the people behind him. So, but there goes that aspect of it. Now, when it comes to, you mentioned the policies on Medicare and Medicaid, food stamps and stuff, that all of that is lumped together into this Republican attack on what they call entitlements. And that's just code word for, helping other people. And they don't want to help other people because you're imposing taxes. Basically, that's an example of good government. when you use taxation to help people who couldn't otherwise help themselves. Now, granted, Medicare and Social Security, that's something you pay into throughout your entire working life. You're seen as guaranteeing that will be paid back to you. But what the Republicans want, see, they saw that as a problem because that was the government guaranteeing that you will have insurance, whether it's social insurance for Social Security or health insurance through Medicare, or even insurance in your employment through unemployment insurance, or even workers' compensation. And all of those things are guarantees by the government that you will be covered when things go wrong. But the Republicans don't like that because they like those guarantees to be privatized, to be for the benefit of the few, to profit off of your needs. So they see that as an attack on capitalism. And that's another discussion for another day, the whole issue of capitalism and stuff. But I keep saying that about a lot of issues, but this is a possibility to get into like a 6-hour long conversation. And I don't think you want to get into that right now. There's a lot of editing you'd have to do. But either way, it's popular with fascists to use programs like to do this, stuff like this, because that's a part of how they divide us against each other. They'll look at the middle class and they'll say, this government and the rich, they're not the reason for your